In the spring of 2009 in Brennan County, a livestock buyer named Dale Hovers stood in the gravel turnaround of a sagging dairy farm and told a 26-year-old widow that she had inherited a debt with a house attached and that the kindest thing she could do for herself was to sign the herd over to him at 60 cents on the dollar and walk away before the bank made her walk away for free. He was not unkind when he said it. He had a clipboard under his arm and a pickup with the county co-op decal on the door, and he had been pricing cattle in that valley for 30 years. And by every number he knew how to read, he was right. 2 years later, in the summer of 2011, that same woman signed the papers that made her the owner of the Brennan County Feed and Supply, the store where Dale Hovers bought his mineral blocks and his fence wire, and she paid for it in full, with no note carried by anyone. This is the story of the span between those two gravel turnarounds and of the man who misread it, and of a notebook that nobody but a dead man had ever thought was worth anything. Let me tell you about Hannah Mercer first, because the woman who signed those papers in 2011 was not the woman Dale Hovers wrote off in 2009, though she had the same hands and the same 101 things that needed doing before dark. She was 26 years old that spring. She had been married for 4 years to a man named Tom Mercer, who had grown up on that ground and worked it the way his father had worked it, and Tom had died in March of 2009 when a tractor rolled on a slope above the creek that he had crossed 10,000 times. He left her 300 acres in the bottoms of Brennan County, a milking parlor with 40 Holsteins in it, a mortgage with 11 years left to run, and a barn whose main beam had cracked in the February ice and brought a third of the roof down into the hay. She was known in that valley for 2 things. She was quiet, the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for slow, and she could remember numbers. Not the way a person remembers a phone number for an afternoon, but the way some people remember faces, permanently and without effort, so that she could tell you what a particular cow had given on a particular wet Tuesday 2 years gone, and what the milk check had been the month her husband proposed. Tom used to say she kept the books in her head better than the bank kept them on paper, and he was not wrong, and it would matter more than either of them ever guessed. The day Dale Hovers came up the drive, the barn was still half down. Hannah had hauled what hay she could salvage out from under the broken roof and stacked it under tarps, and the rest had gone to rot and mold in the wet, which is its own small grief on a farm, watching feed you cannot replace turn black in the rain. She had 40 cows that needed milking twice a day, and a parlor that needed a part she could not afford, and a beam overhead she did not dare stand a man under. Hovers parked his truck and looked at all of it, the dropped roof and the tarped hay and the young woman in her dead husband's barn coat, and he did the arithmetic out loud, because he believed that arithmetic was a kindness when the truth was hard. He told her the herd was worth maybe 40,000 at auction, less the hauling, and that the repair on the barn would run her 20, just to make it safe, and that the bank would want its payment in April, whether the roof was on or not. He told her a farm this size could not carry a single operator, that Tom had run it on his own back and his own debt, and the margin had been thin even then, and that a woman alone, however willing, could not milk 40 head and fix a barn and make a mortgage on the price of milk in 2009, which had fallen through the floor that very year and taken half the dairies in the county down with it. He was right about the price. That part was not cruelty. The price of milk in 2009 was a catastrophe that did not care who you were. What he said last was the thing she remembered. He told her, kindly, that she was in over her head, and that there was no shame in it, and that he would write her a check for the cattle that very afternoon, and she could be free of the whole sad business by supper time. He called her honey when he said it. He did not mean it as a wound. It landed as one anyway, the way a soft word can when it is built on the certainty that you are too small for your own life. Hannah did not sign. She told him she would think on it, which in that valley is the politest way a person has of saying no, and she watched his truck go back down the drive with the old cattle dog Pace at her heel, where he always was. And then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table that Tom's grandfather had built out of a black walnut that had come down on the property in 1951, and she did not cry, though she had earned the right to. She opened the drawer under the tabletop where Tom kept the things he did not know what to do with, and she took out a notebook she had seen 100 times and never once read. Let me tell you about that notebook, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. It was a ledger, the kind a feed store used to give away, free with a sack of seed, bound in cracked oilcloth and swollen at the spine from years of being carried in a coat pocket through wet weather. It had belonged to Tom's grandfather, Walter Mercer, who had farmed that same bottom ground from 1948 until he died in 1989. And Walter had been a man who wrote things down, not feelings. Walter never wrote a feeling in his life. He wrote weights and dates and prices. He wrote what every cow gave, and what he fed her, and what the feed had cost, and what the milk had brought, line after line, year after year, in a hand that got smaller and tighter as the decades went on. To Tom, it had been a keepsake, a dead grandfather's handwriting too precious to throw out and too dull to read. To the bank it would have been nothing, a box of old paper. To Hannah Mercer, sitting at that walnut table with a barn down and a buyer's card on the counter, it became, over the course of one long night, the most valuable thing on the farm, because Walter Mercer had not just recorded numbers. He had recorded the answer to a question nobody in 2009 was asking anymore, which was how a single family had kept 40 acres of cows alive and paying through the milk crashes of 1953 and 1972, when the price went exactly as low as it had gone now. She read until the lamp oil of the morning, which is to say, she read until the cows told her it was time to milk. And what she found in Walter's tight hand was a way of farming that the whole county had spent 50 years walking away from, and that Dale Hovers, pricing cattle off a clipboard, did not have a column for. Let me tell you what Walter had done, because the mechanism is the thing, and without it, this is just a sad story with a happy accident at the end, and it was not an accident. Walter Mercer had never bought much feed. That was the whole of it, and it sounds too simple to be worth a notebook, but the simplicity is a trap, the way a chess opening is simple. In the modern dairy that Tom had built, and that Hovers understood, a cow was a machine you fed at one end to get milk out of the other, and the feed came off a truck. Corn and soybean meal and supplement, bought on credit against the milk check. So that the whole operation was a thin pipe, with money flowing in one direction and milk flowing the other, and almost no room between them. When the milk price fell, the pipe ran dry, and the cows kept eating, and the dairy died. That was happening up and down the valley in 2009. It was arithmetic, and Hovers could read it, and it was killing people he had known his whole life. Walter's arithmetic was different. Walter had grazed. He had kept fewer cows on more grass, and he had bred them small and hardy off a line he had built himself across 4 decades. Animals that did not give the towering volumes a fed Holstein gave, but that held their condition on pasture. That turned grass nobody was paying for into milk he did not have to buy the feed. to make his ledger showed it plainly, once you knew how to read it. In a good year, a fed cow might outproduce one of Walter's 2-to-1. A fed cow, though, cost money every single day she lived, rain or shine, milk price up or down, and Walter's cows mostly cost him time and fence. And when the price collapsed, as it had in 1953 and 1972, and now again in 2009, the fed dairy bled out and Walter's pasture operation simply tightened its belt and waited because grass does not send an invoice. There was more. In the notebook than grazing, there were breeding records going back to a foundation cow Walter had bought in 1951. A long, careful line selected for exactly the traits a grass dairy needs. There were the names of the old paddocks and the dates he moved stock between them, a rotation he had worked out by watching, not by reading, a way of moving the herd across the ground so that the grass was always grazed hard and then rested long, which Hannah would later learn the agronomists had a name for and a science behind, and which Walter had simply called doing it right. The herd that Hannah had inherited from Tom was not Walter's herd. Tom had bought in big-fed Holsteins and sold off most of the old line, because the old line did not pencil out in a world of cheap feed and high milk. Not all of it, though. 11 head of Walter's small, hardy cattle were still in that parlor in the spring of 2009, kept by Tom out of sentiment, the way the notebook had been kept, because they were his grandfather's and he could not quite let them go. 11 cows. Hannah counted them in the dark, the next morning, the way you count money. They were the unfashionable ones, the small ones, the ones Hovers had glanced at and valued at nothing because they would dress out light and milk low. To the buyer, they were 11 head of cull. To Hannah, by the gray light of that morning, they were a foundation she had thought was lost. She did not know yet exactly what she would do. She knew, though, that she was not going to sell them, and she knew she was not going to sign Dale Hovers' check. And she knew that somewhere in Walter's tight columns was a way through a year that everyone with a degree and a clipboard had told her she could not survive. I will tell you now, because you have stayed with me this far, that the thing that saved Hannah Mercer was not stubbornness, though she had that. It was that she could read a ledger the way other people read a face, and Walter had left her a true one. If you have ever had a thing handed to you that everyone else called worthless and found out later what it really was, you already understand this story. Stay with me, because the part where the numbers turn is coming. And it is better than I can make it sound here. That first year, 2009 into 2010, was the hard one, and I will not pretend otherwise. Hannah did not transform the farm in a season, because you cannot. She did one thing, which was to stop the bleeding. He could not keep milking 40 fed cows on a milk price that did not cover their feed, so she did the thing that looked, to everyone watching, like surrender. She sold the fed Holsteins, not to Hovers, and not at 60 cents, but slowly in small lots, to dairies that still believed the price would come back. And she got a fair number for them because a milking cow in her prime is worth something even in a bad year, if you are patient and sell her one at a time instead of dumping 30 at auction on a Tuesday. To the valley, it looked like Dale Hovers had been right, just slower than he predicted. The Mercer widow was selling off the herd. Folks said it the way people say a thing they find sad and a little inevitable. They did not see what she kept. She kept the 11, she kept Walter's 11 small, hardy cows, and she took the money from the fed herd, and she did not spend it on a new barn or a parlor part. Let me tell you about the fence, because this is where the teaching is. Raising dairy is built on fence the way a feedlot is built on a feed truck. Walter's old rotation needed the pastures divided into small paddocks, so the herd could be moved every day or two onto fresh grass and the grazed ground left to recover. Tom had let most of those fences fall, because a fed herd does not need them. Hannah spent the winter of 2010 walking Walter's old paddock map against the actual ground, finding the lines of old posts under the brush, and she put up miles of single-strand electric fence, which is cheap and light, and a person can build it alone, which mattered because she was alone. By the spring of 2010, she had Walter's rotation back on the land and 11 cows walking it, and a barn still half down because the fence came first. And that order of operations was the whole argument of her life, laid out in wire. The agronomist arrived in May of 2010. His name was Curtis Pell, and he came not to dismiss her but to help her, which is worth saying plainly because Curtis Pell was a sincere man and a smart one, and most of what he believed was true. He worked for the Regional Extension Service, and part of his job was checking on operations the bank had flagged as troubled, and the Mercer place was flagged in red. He was perhaps 35, with a soil science degree and a county car and a tablet full of forage models. And he walked Hannah's pastures with real concern and told her, gently and with numbers, that she was making a mistake. He told her the stocking rate was wrong. He told her 11 cows on 300 acres was a hobby, not a dairy, that she was leaving the land's productive capacity on the table, that with inputs and improved genetics and a proper feeding program, she could run 150 head on that ground, and actually, he showed her the model on the tablet, the curve of it, the projected income, and the model was not lying exactly. Within its assumptions, it was correct. Curtis Pell believed in the unmeasured the way a man believes in a country he has never visited, which is to say, abstractly and without much weight. He measured what his model measured, and his model measured production. And by production, Hannah Mercer was running a museum. She listened to all of it. She did not argue because she had learned from Walter's notebook that arguing with a confident man is a way of losing an afternoon. She asked him one question. She asked him what his model did when the milk price went to $9. He told her reasonably that you planned for the average and wrote out the lows, and she nodded, and she thought about the columns in Walter's hand for 1953, when the price had gone to the equivalent of $9 and the fed dairies had ridden it straight into foreclosure. She did not say that. She thanked Curtis Pell for coming. He left believing she had not understood him, and he wrote in his report that the operator was undercapitalized and resistant to technical guidance, which was true and which missed everything. That was the first time the word hobby got said out loud to her face. It was not the last. Now, let me tell you about Royce Tillman, because no story like this is only about the one who held on. There was a man across the river, a good man, who did everything right by the book that Curtis Pell carried. Royce Tillman had farmed alongside Tom Mercer, and after Tom died, he had taken Curtis Pell's advice the way Hannah had not. He saw the same low price Hannah saw, and where she retreated to grass, he doubled down on scale, because the extension models all said the same thing, that the way through a low price is volume, that you make it up on the margin by running more head and squeezing the cost per hundredweight, and that the small operator dies and the big one survives. It was the conventional wisdom, and it was not stupid. It had been true more often than not for 50 years. So Royce borrowed. He built a new freestyle barn in 2010, a long, bright building with fans and automatic scrapers, and a feed mixer that could load a day's ration in 20 minutes, and he bought 60 more fed Holsteins to fill it, financed against the herd and the land, and for a year and a half he looked like the future, and Hannah Mercer looked like the past. People in the valley said as much. They watched Royce's new barn go up with its white steel sides catching the light, and they watched the Mercer widow move 11 small cows across a field on foot behind a single wire, and the contrast told a story everybody thought they already knew the ending of. Let me tell you what the 11 cows were doing while Royce filled his barn, because this is the part the model could not see. They were grazing Walter's rotation, and the rotation was doing what Walter had spent 40 years proving it would do. When you move cattle onto fresh grass, and then off it before they graze it to the dirt, and you let that paddock rest for 30 or 40 days before they come back, the grass does not just regrow. The roots go deeper each cycle because a plant grazed and rested builds reserves below ground, and deep roots reach water that shallow roots cannot, and the soil between them fills with life, with the fine threads and the worm runs and the dark crumb that holds rain like a sponge. Walter had written it in his own words across 40 years without ever using a scientific term. Hannah read it in the columns. By the second summer, her grazed paddocks were greener in a dry spell than her neighbors' fed pastures because they were drinking from deeper down. She did not have to buy that. The grass made it, and the cows turned it into milk, and the milk cost her almost nothing but the moving of the wire. She bred the 11 back to a bull off the old line that a grazier 2 counties over still kept, and the 11 became 19, and the 19 would become 30, all of them small and hardy and cheap to keep, all of them carrying Walter's 40 years of selection in their blood. She was not getting rich. Nobody watching would have said she was even getting by. Her cost of production, though, the number Curtis Pell had taught her to calculate, and then watched her calculate against herself, was falling every season, while across the river Royce Tillman's cost of production was a fixed and terrible weight that did not care what the milk price did. He had to feed 60 new cows every day, whether the check covered it or not. She had to move a wire. The midpoint of this story is a quiet one, and I want to mark it because the loud part is coming, and it is easy to forget that the turn happened first in silence, in a notebook, in a field, before anyone with authority noticed. By the fall of 2010, Hannah Mercer was current on her mortgage. Not ahead. Current. She had made every payment on a dairy that everyone had told her could not make a single one. And she had done it on 11 cows and a dead man's rotation and the money from a herd she had been brave enough to sell. The barn was still half down. She milked in the sound half, and nobody knew, because being current on a mortgage is not news and a quiet woman does not announce it. Then came the drought of 2011, and the drought did what no argument could. Let me tell you about that summer, plainly, because the structural shock is the place where the 2 kinds of knowing stop being a matter of opinion and become a matter of fact. The spring of 2011 came in dry, and the rain, that should have come in May, did not come, and it did not come in June either. And by the first week of July, the Brennan County bottoms, the fed dairies felt it first in the worst way because their pastures, grazed flat and shallow-rooted, burned off in 3 weeks and left them buying every pound their cattle ate. Hay, tripled corn, followed. Royce Tillman, with 120 head in a barn built to be filled, woke up every morning to a feed bill that had doubled against a milk price that had not moved, and there was nothing in his model and nothing in Curtis Pell's tablet that could fix the one fact that mattered, which was that he had built an operation that ate money fastest, exactly when money was hardest to find. Across the river, Hannah's grazed paddocks held. They did not stay green like a wet ear. The deep roots and the spongy soil that 4 cycles of rest had built reached water the burnt fields could not, and the grass kept growing slower, but growing, all through the worst of July, on ground that had not been irrigated and had not been fed and had cost her nothing but the patience of 2 years. She was moving 30 small cows across pasture that was feeding them, Pace working wide and low along the wire, the way he had since he was a pup, while the whole valley bought hay at a price that was breaking the strong. Curtis Pell drove out in late July to check the flagged operations again, and he stood at Hannah Mercer's fence line, and he saw the thing his model did not have a column for, which was a green field in a brown county, 30 cows in good flesh, and a woman he had written up as resistant to technical guidance standing in the one operation in the bottoms that the drought had not touched. He did not say much that day. He was an honest man, and an honest man in front. Of a fact he did not predict, gets quiet. Still, the word that had been said as hobby in 2010 got said one more time that summer, and the third time it was said by Royce Tillman himself, across a counter at the Brennan County Feed and Supply, where he had come to buy hay he could not afford, and where he saw Hannah buying almost nothing. Just tired and beaten and trying to understand that he could not believe her little hobby was the thing still standing. He meant it as the surrender it was. She did not answer him. She had never once in 2 years answered the word, because the field was answering it for her, in green, in the worst July anyone could remember. Which brings us to the reveal, and I am going to slow down here, because it deserves the slowing. In August of 2011, the Agricultural College, 2 hours north, sent a forage researcher down to the Brennan County bottoms, because word had reached them, the way word does, that there was an operation in the drought zone that was still grazing when everyone around it was buying feed, and the college wanted to measure it. The researcher's name was Dr. Lena Ostrand, and she was the qualified outside judge this story had been waiting for. A soil scientist who had spent her career measuring exactly the thing Curtis Pell's model could not see. She came with equipment, with a soil corer and a plate meter and a lab 2 hours away, and she spent 3 days on Hannah Mercer's 300 acres, measuring what the grazing had built. She measured the forage. She measured the soil. She pulled cores from Hannah's grazed paddocks and from a neighbor's continuously grazed pasture across the road. The same soil type, the same slope, the same rain, the only difference being 11 years of Walter's rotation against 11 years of conventional grazing. And on the 3rd day, she sat down at the walnut table where it had all started with her lab sheets in front of her, and she told Hannah Mercer the number. The grazed paddocks were holding 4 times the available soil moisture of the conventional ground. 4 times. She said it once, and then she was quiet, because she was a scientist, and she knew what a number like that meant in a drought year, and she let it sit in the kitchen the way you let a heavy thing sit. 4 times the water, in the same soil, under the same dead sky, built by nothing but the moving of cattle in a pattern a dead man had worked out by watching his own grass for 40 years. That was why the field was green. That was the whole secret, measured and proven and written on a lab sheet by a woman with a doctorate, and it was the same secret Walter had written in oilcloth, in a hand too small to read easily, and it had been sitting in a drawer under a kitchen table the entire time that Dale Hovers was offering 60 cents on the dollar to take it away. 4 times the water. Dr. Ostrand wrote it into a study that the college published the following year, and the study named the Mercer operation, and graziers started driving to Brennan County to see the field that had held through 2011. That is getting ahead, though. On the day she said it, there was just the number, and the quiet after it, and a young woman who had known in her bones for 2 years what it took a soil core 3 days to confirm. Hannah did not gloat. There was no one to gloat at. The two men who might have heard it as a defeat were not in the room, and even if they had been, gloating was not in her, because Walter's notebook had taught her that the land does not care who is right, it only answers what you ask of it. And she had simply asked the right question. What she felt, she told no one, but you can guess at it from what she did next, which was the truest measure of the woman. Let me tell you what she did with being proven right, because it is the moral center of the whole thing. She did not scale up doctory. Ostrand's study brought attention, and attention in farming usually means an offer. And the offers came investors who wanted to put money into the operation and run Walter's method across 10,000 acres and make it pay the way scale pays. Hannah turned them down. She had read enough of Walter's ledger to know that the method was not a machine you could make bigger without breaking, that it depended on a person walking the ground and reading the grass and moving the wire by judgment, not by formula, and that the moment you handed it to a manager with a model, it became the very thing it had beaten. She kept the operation the size one person could truly know: 30 cows, 300 acres, the size of a thing a human being can hold in her head, which was the only size Walter had ever trusted, and the only size that had ever survived a drought. What she did instead was the Brennan County Feed and Supply. The store had been failing for years, because a feed store in a county where the dairies are dying is a feed store with no customers, and the old owner wanted out before the bank took it. Hannah bought it in the summer of 2011 with cash she had saved from 2 years of selling milk at almost no cost of production, while everyone around her sold milk at a loss, and she paid for it in full, no note. The very thing Dale Hovers had told her she would never do with anything again. She did not buy it to sell feed, though she sold it. She bought it because a feed store in a farm county is the one room where every farmer comes, and she had something she wanted every farmer in Brennan County to be able to walk in and find, which was a way through the next bad year that did not depend on the feed truck at all. She put Walter's rotation on the wall, not the notebook itself that stayed in the drawer under the walnut table where it belonged, but the method, drawn out plain, the paddock map and the rest periods and the breeding principles, and she taught it free to anyone who asked. And after the drought of 2011, Curtis Pell asked, "That is the recalibration, and I will give it to you, the way it happened, without drama, because the man earned an honest accounting." He came into the store in the fall of 2011 in his extension shirt with the agency logo, and he did not pretend he had been right. He told her plainly that the model he carried did not measure soil water built over years, that it priced a pasture on this season's growth and had no column for what rest and roots did across a decade, and that he had written her up as resistant when the truth was that she was patient and he had been measuring the wrong thing. He asked if she would walk him through the rotation. He asked to be taught, and Hannah Mercer, who had never once answered the word hobby, answered that. She walked him out to the paddocks, and she taught him, and within 2 years the Extension Service in Brennan County was recommending the very rotation it had once flagged in red, and Curtis Pell was the one recommending it, which is the best thing that can happen to a sincere man who finds out he was wrong. That he gets to spend the rest of his career being right about it instead. Royce Tillman did not recover everything. I will not tell you he did, because the casualties of conventional advice are real, and this story does not pretend otherwise. He lost the new barn. The bank took it in 2012, the long, bright building with its fans and its scrapers, and it stood empty across the river for years, which is its own kind of monument. He did not lose the home place, though, because Hannah Mercer carried him through the worst of it on credit at the feed store that she never once called credit, and because when he was ready, beaten and humble and done with scale, she taught him the rotation too, and he put his remaining ground to grass and a small hardy herd off the old line, and he made a living again, smaller and surer than the one he had chased. He was not a foolish man. He had simply believed what everyone believed, and almost everyone who believed it went down. And the difference between Royce Tillman and the ones who did not come back was that he had a neighbor who had been proven right and chose to be generous about it instead of proud. Let me tell you about Dale Hovers, because the story owes him a return, and the return is quiet. He kept buying cattle in that valley for years, off his clipboard, with his 30 years of knowing what a cow was worth. He was never cruel, and he was never a villain. He had read a real arithmetic on a real spring day and told a young widow the truth as his numbers gave it to him. And his numbers had been right about everything, except the one thing they could not measure, which was what Walter Mercer had spent a lifetime building under the ground and writing down in oilcloth. Hovers lived long enough to buy mineral and fence wire at the Brennan County Feed and Supply from the woman he had offered 60 cents on the dollar, and the story goes that he never spoke of that spring, and neither did she, and that the only acknowledgement that ever passed between them was that he kept coming to her store, and she always had what he needed, and the account was never once short. There are apologies that get spoken, and apologies that get lived, and that was the second kind. Now, let me tell you the part I have been holding, the part about why she could read the ledger when no one else could, because it is the answer to the question the whole story asks. Hannah Mercer remembered numbers the way other people remember faces. That was the gift, and it had looked like nothing. The way the 11 cows had looked like nothing, and the notebook had looked like nothing, and the small grazed field had looked like nothing next to a bright new barn. The county had a name for the new barn and the 120 head and the feed mixer that loaded a ration in 20 minutes. The county had no name for a woman who could hold 40 years of a dead man's columns in her head and see, where everyone else saw old paper, a working argument about how to survive. There are two kinds of knowledge in this world. There is the kind that measures what is easy to measure and prices it and builds a confident model on it and runs 120 cows into a drought. And there is the kind that watches one piece of ground for 40 years and writes down what it sees and hands it to someone patient enough to read it. The first kind is louder, and it is right more often than not, in the years that do not test it. The second kind is quiet, and it does not pencil out on any tablet, and it is the only thing standing in the field when the dry sky finally comes. The barn, in the end, got built. Not in 2009, when Hovers said it had to be, and not in 2010, when the fence came first, but in the fall of 2011, after the feed store, after the study, after the green field in the Brown County had answered every word that had ever been said to her. She built it with cash, the same as the store, and she built it smaller than the one that had fallen, because 30 cows do not need the barn that 40 fed Holsteins needed, and she had learned that the right size of a thing is the size it actually needs to be, and not one board more. She built it over the old footprint on the same stone foundation Walter had laid, and she used the black walnut beam off the tree that had come down on the property the winter before, milled and cured and raised by a crew of neighbors, half of whom were farming Walter's rotation, now because she had taught it to them at the store for free. Hannah Mercer is still on that ground. The notebook is still in the drawer under the walnut table, and the table is still in the kitchen, and the rotation is still drawn on the wall of the Brennan County Feed and Supply, where any farmer who walks in can read it. And Pace, grayer now, still walks the paddocks at her heel when she moves the herd at evening. She never got rich, by the county's way of counting, and she would tell you she never wanted to, and you would believe her. She got something the county had no column for. She got a piece of ground that could hold 4 times the water of the field across the road, and a herd that carried a dead man's 40 years of care in its blood, and a store where the knowledge could not be lost again. And the quiet certainty of a person who was told she was in over her head and found out instead that she was the only one standing on solid ground. What is rigid breaks? What is patient holds? And the most valuable thing on a farm is almost never the thing the buyer can see from his truck.